Namaste, everyone. Welcome to the Cārvāka podcast. This is Kushalmehra. All right, today we're going to talk about Matt's new book. I have to admit to this. Matt is a prolific writer. I struggle to write one book, and I'm researching for my second book. And I think this is
Congratulations, by the way.
thanks, man. But I think this is the fourth book. Matt, is the fourth book I'm covering on the podcast?
Maybe, yeah. I mean, you and I have talked quite a bit, and when we don't chat on the podcast, sometimes we chat online also. But yeah, I think that sounds about right.
Yeah, I think this is your fourth book. So today we're going to talk about the political theory of liberal socialism. First of all, this is probably one of my favorite reads, is because this is a subject very close to my heart. It talks about individualism, it talks about liberalism, it talks about all things that are very close to me as someone who I don't consider myself to be a dyed-in-wool Western thinker, because I think from a very Indian perspective. And when I say Indian perspective, I mean a literally Indian perspective, where I use Indian epistemology many times. But I really enjoyed reading this book is because in this book, you've made a case which is going to get to the nerves of many people these days, especially popular YouTubers who claim liberalism has nothing to do with socialism. And in this book, you quite I don't know what's the word in this, very categorically state that liberalism and socialism have deeply connected roots. And you try to explain this. But before we get into the details of the book, why did you pick this subject? Was it like a precursor to some of your previous work or the work in the future? What was that?
Sure. Well, first off, thanks for having me back on. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, and I really enjoy the pushback and the back and forth that we always have. Right. As you said before, one of the things that I really like about our chats is the fact that you and I can disagree with one another, but we always do so respectfully and with a great deal of affection. So there were a couple things that motivated me to write this book. I think there'll just be three that I focus on. One of the things that motivated me to write this was just the fact that I'd always been convinced that there was a deeper affinity between, call it the left and liberalism, or liberalism and socialism, than many people who identified as liberals or leftists kind of let on. And this came through very, very clearly when I would talk, especially to my leftist friends. And I would ask them, like, do you really think that like freedom of expression isn't important? Freedom of religion isn't important. Freedom of assembly isn't important, right? The right to vote isn't important. And most of my leftist friends would kind of give you a bit of a weird look, like, what are you talking about? Of course, we think those things are important. If anything, right, we don't think that these rights or these principles are safe in the hands of normie or centrist liberals. So I really wanted to use this book as an opportunity to kind of make explicit some of those kinds of intimations. The second thing that inspired it, both politically and practically, is, as you know, I've spent an awful lot of time looking at and researching the political right. And one of the things that you find on the political right is many on the right insist that there is this categorical affiliation between liberalism and socialism. Now, sometimes this is just meant kind of as a slander, and it's a very crude kind of conflation. And, think about all the types who are like any kind of liberalism is postmodern neo-Marxism, or James Lindsay today characterizing Kamala Harris as a Maoist, right? Just completely ridiculous stuff. But there are more intelligent conservative commentators. I'm thinking here like Martin Heidegger, who was actually on the radical right, who noted that there is a deep metaphysical affinity between the two doctrines, in the sense that they both emerged from the Enlightenment. They're both committed to humanism and rationalism, and they both think that the end goal of politics should basically be to secure the material conditions and the social and political conditions for human flourishing. So my thinking was very stamped by a lot of these right thinkers, actually, who made this kinds of argument. And I guess the third and last thing that I'll talk about is kind of in line with what I said before. I've often been criticized, quite rightly, for always talking about what I don't like. People are like, you sit there all day and you just trash, postmodern conservatism, and you trash this and you trash that. They're like, well, what do you stand for, right? And I thought, well, that's fair enough. So now I'm actually going to kind of put myself out there a little bit and write a book that is closer to my heart in terms of expressing my own political convictions. So the end result is what you end up reading, and I'm glad that you said you enjoyed it. Right? You're one of the first.
I had a lot of fun. Because if you remember, I had sent you that excerpt from the book about John Stuart Mill's thoughts, and I said, when I was reading John Stuart Mill and his love for the rural life, and his rationale, actually how he celebrates the rural life, is actually very similar to how Gandhi used to celebrate all these things. It was very
Oh, really?
interesting to me. Yeah, Gandhi and his love for the village life and how life should be village cooperatives. And so Gandhi abhorred modernity in many ways. Gandhi was very anti-technology. Um, Gandhi, in a very weird way, was also anti-vaccination on unique occasions of his life. And Gandhi was all over the place. He opposed the railways and many such things. And it's all mentioned in his book Hindu Swaraj. Gandhi talks about his reasons for opposing. A lot of it stemmed from his idea of, I want to decolonize, I want to oppose the colonizer. And he used to give his reasons for his opposition. But John Stuart Mill, like, I want to read this excerpt from the book, and I want to start at this premise, and then we'll go back, because this premise is very interesting. And this is where you write, more interesting than why he became a socialist is what kind of socialism Mill endorsed and the arguments he put forward for his positions. Here it is impossible to improve on Helen McCabe's pioneering book, John Stuart Mill, Socialist, which unpacks the various dimensions of Mill's socialism expertly. She stresses how Mill rather predictably was undoctrinaire. Though he regarded himself as a socialist by the quote mid 1840s, he did not quote endorse any particular contemporary form of socialism. He was not a Marxist or an overnight or even a Fourierist or a Saint Simonian. Instead, he put himself under the general designation of socialist, developing his own unique and nuanced view. His form of socialism was decentralized, cooperative, and voluntarist. It was rooted in cooperatives, complemented by some state provision, which is why I said it is very similar to Gandhian thoughts. But the most counterintuitive thing that most people will be like, they associate today in the pop culture psychology John Stuart Mill to being a right winger or a right of center person. Or have you not come across this?
Oh, I've come across it a lot, right? And part of this is because in the 1990s, at the end of the Cold War, John Stuart Mill was almost always presented as fundamentally a classical liberal, right? Somebody who's committed to, let's just put it really simply, life, liberty, and property, right? And one of the things that McCabe and myself, and for that matter, people like John Gray have pointed out, is that this is a fundamental misreading of John Stuart Mill, right? Mill, took great pride in his autobiography on always being on, and I quote, the progressive end of liberalism, oddly enough on every issue except for the death penalty, and of course expressly identified as a socialist in his autobiography, and write quite a few positive things about how a feasible socialism could be carried out. Now, as you gesture to with Professor McCabe's book, his socialism was distinctly liberal, and I characterize him as the founder of a kind of mature liberal socialist political theory in the book. Just to kind of summarize it really briefly, right? By the 1840s, 1850s, Mill was convinced largely that there was really no need for capitalists in firms. For the most part, they didn't really contribute all that much, aside from a little bit of know-how, and that know-how was usually possessed in spades by the workers themselves anyway. So he suggested that there be this transition to a kind of cooperative economy with worker-owned firms that would be market-oriented. So it's kind of market socialism in the sense that these firms would still compete with one another, but there wouldn't be private ownership of the means of production in the sense that capitalists own the firms. And then this would be accompanied by, of course, various kinds of welfarist reforms. Mill was very supportive, certainly in the 19th century, of providing robust education for all in a way that very few people in the United Kingdom were, and various other kinds of reforms to basically ensure that people had access to a primitive kind of universal health care. And then, Mill also wanted this to be accompanied by liberalizing reforms, right? Expanding the terrain of personal liberty, particularly freedom of expression, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, over and against socially conservative forces. So it's a very interesting argument for liberal socialism, or a kind of liberal socialism articulated by Mill. I have problems with it that I lay out in the book, not least, of course, being the fact that Mill was a supporter of things like Indian colonization and imperialism of the British in India for all kinds of racist and chauvinistic reasons that we can talk about if you want. But I think there's quite a bit that's attractive in his ideal nonetheless, as long as we are sufficiently critical of the xenophobic aspects of it.
You know what? I would love to stay on this bit of Mill and his views on India or colonialism, and this is my conclusion. Often, a lot of people talk about these figures in the past with absolutism, whether it's Winston Churchill, whether it's many other figures.
Of course, yeah.
You could do the same thing with Gandhi also, and Gandhi had some problematic views himself. And the question I always ask, in fact, this is something that I had done a monologue on, where I had said, how do we judge historical figures? How do we judge, like, what is the best landmark of judging historical figures? Like you said, Mill had very problematic views. Long story short, he thought we were barbarians. We as in Indians were
Yes.
barbarians, and barbarians deserve to be controlled and colonized. And I kind of fall back sometimes on Michael Shermer, and how Michael Shermer, when he explains, right, the moral arc of humanity, how our core instinct of tribalism, we're all tribal, whether we like it or not. The story of the human Homo sapien is getting over their tribalism over a period of time. I'm not making the naturalistic fallacy. Obviously, there is nature and nurture here, but the point is, at its core, the nature does exist, and we are tribal. And how we get over our tribalism, and that is the story there, where maybe Mill's liberalism was only for, let's say, his kind of white people. But at the end of the day, can I use that idea, if it makes sense, and expand it, going beyond what Mill tried to say? And that's something, do you think, are we even capable of doing that now when we look at historical figures?
I think it's very difficult. And like you, I tend to think that we need to approach historical figures with a degree of understanding, but also a degree of severity. There's a kind of virtuous mean that we can hit, right? Just exonerating historical figures for their bad inclinations or the mistakes they mean, it's kind of a politically correct form of whitewashing, right? And ironically enough, I think conservatives of all people should be the most scathingly critical of this for exactly that reason, right? On the other hand, you do need to appreciate that none of us are perfect. It's very possible that 200 years from now, some historian will be looking through the YouTube archives or whatever, find this podcast and think, boy, those guys have weird views about things. Who knows, right? And I think rather like one approaches a parent, it's important to maturely understand their faults and grasp them cogently, while also appreciating the kind of good things that they've given to us, if that metaphor makes sense. And in terms of Mill, there's a really good book written about this for your listeners who are interested, by Uday Mehta from Columbia University, called Liberalism and Empire. And Mehta reconstructs the Mill's justifications for imperialism, particularly in India, but elsewhere around the world. And the way he frames it is that Mill was an egalitarian at heart in many respects, right? But he was an egalitarian who thought that people need to be trained to be members of an equal society. And a lot of this had to do with education. So he felt that the British, or Englishmen, circa the 19th century, had become sufficiently educated, cultivated, and civilized so that they were ready, if you want to call it that, for representative democracy, liberal socialism, etc. But that Indians and other people around the world simply weren't prepared for that. So if anything, empire was a kind of benign, paternalistic form of despotism that would actually benefit them by uplifting their level of civilization. Now we know, of course, because of the brutalities of the British regime, certainly the British East India Company that Mill worked for, which also suggests that this argument was self-serving on his part, right, was nothing like a kind of benign paternalistic despotism, right? It wreaked havoc on the Indian economy, killed thousands of people, millions if you get into the 20th century, and we're all better off seeing the back of it, right? So I think that that's a big point against some of these kinds of Millsian intimations. And in terms of, can we just kind of relegate that to the past? I would say that actually we can't just relegate it to the past, right? There are certainly liberals to this day who still take this kind of chauvinistic attitude, certainly towards developing states all across the globe, and imagine it is their responsibility to improve them, even if that seems to be contrary to liberal principles, because these are societies that aren't quite ready for liberalism and democracy and self-government at this point. And I want nothing to do with that. Certainly as part of a generation that was that came out of the Iraq War, for example, right? But just to be forgiving as well, it's important to note that Mill was very far ahead of his time on things like the feminist movement, right? Probably wrote the only classic work of feminist theory by a male author on the subjection of women, argued for giving women the right to vote, granting them opportunities to divorce men who were abusive, saw women fundamentally as social equals, also very ahead on issues like abolitionism, right? Cheerleaded the end of slavery in the American South. So there are a lot of good things that Mill had a lot of foresight on. So I don't think that we should dismiss his thought because he was committed to this one especially bad program, even if we need to make sure that we are very critical of his support for that program.
Not just that, the harm principle, I think one of the fundamental building blocks when it comes to policy discussions
Absolutely.
Is the harm principle, because how does one justify free speech? Is that as long as the harm principle is not violated, and a lot of policies like drunken driving, even drunken driving is banned using the Mill argument of the harm principle, that when you are inebriated and you can't drive and you're going to end up harming someone physically, and that's where the harm principle and a lot of second order effects of the harm principle are used. So nobody, any modern political theory student cannot ignore the fact that John Stuart Mill actually had a lot of contributions, whether they like it or not. Honestly, they cannot ignore Mill. At the same time, they cannot ignore that Mill was someone. I think he was racist. If you ask
Yes,
me personally, he was racist, and it's funny how there was this recent episode of Tucker Carlson, and that I don't know who that historian was. I really, and he was trying to, in a very
I have a piece coming out for Commonweal magazine about this very soon. And that didn't come out that didn't come out in a vacuum. Let's just put it that way. Go on. Sorry.
Yeah, and this, I don't follow that quote unquote historian's work, and basically he was shining the light on Winston Churchill's record, and he was saying, was Hitler that bad? And in my head, I was like, why do you have to show Hitler in a good light to say Churchill was bad? Why can't both be bad? I don't get the argument. Why can't both be bad? And considering all things, as an Indian, and Winston Churchill was so bad to us, I would say I'd still put Churchill to be better than Hitler. I mean, is Hitler now better than Churchill?
Oh, absolutely right. I don't want to regress too much into this because I have a lot of opinions and they're all pretty angry about this. But this is a very common tactic used by far-right authors, including people like Patrick Buchanan. Some of your audience may be familiar with him, but Pat Buchanan is one of the founders of paleoconservatism in the United States and actually pioneered this kind of genre of historical apologetics, let's call it that, for the Nazi regime in his book, Unnecessary War. And one of the functions of books like this or podcasts like this is, interesting enough, and this is where my postmodern conservatism thesis comes in, to enact a kind of relativizing outlook, right? By saying, look, Nazism wasn't so bad because Churchill was pretty bad, and that means that there's a kind of moral equivalence that we can make between him and people like Hitler, which should mean that we should be less critical or scathingly critical, at least, of people like Adolf Hitler, right? And these movements are extremely dangerous, right? Because by offering these kinds of apologetics, the aim, of course, long-term, is to make public discourse safe again for various kinds of Nazi arguments, which is, of course, exactly what Tucker was trying to do by popularizing a guy who bluntly has an awful lot of nice things to say about Adolf Hitler and an awful lot of nice things to say about Nazism, right? And I think that we should not even politely, but just very firmly slam the door shut on any of that kind of crap.
Yeah, I agree. Now I want to take you back to the baseline, because I don't want to give a lot away of the book, because I want people to understand that this is a very theoretical book, and not that all your books are not theoretical. You are a theoretical writer. Which is why I love reading your books, is because it's like a lesson for me. It's like reading a essay or a PhD paper, and I love doing that. Now people might say, "What the hell, man? Who enjoys these kinds of things?" I love reading these things. I just love that. Now, there are 2-3 fundamental things that I'm glad you did in this book. One was, you try to define liberalism.
Mm-hmm.
You try to define socialism, albeit using other people and their definitions. But I think it's very important. So that's all I want to do for this podcast.
Sure.
Now, the rest of the podcast, for 20 to 25 minutes, we should spend in defining liberalism and defining socialism. And then the follow-up question to that would be, all right, let's assume the historical roots of liberalism and socialism are there, but why can't a right of center person be liberal anymore? They still can. And why can't they redefine liberalism in their lens? So that's all I want to focus on.
Sure. So one of the points that I make in the book is drawing very heavily on Alan Ryan, I think it makes a lot more sense to talk about liberalisms, plural, and socialisms, plural, than either liberalism or socialism. And that actually already begins to answer your question, because to be blunt, I have no problem with people identifying as right liberals or classical liberals or conservative liberals, whatever. They're part of the family. They're just not family members that I happen to identify with on the liberal spectrum. So I point out that both liberalism and socialism are very diverse traditions. There are people who have a wide array of different ideas within both of them, but we still want to kind of say what characterizes the family resemblance that links these traditions together. And when it comes to liberalism, I say, there are many people who have tried to get at the essence of what it means to be liberal. Some people like Maurice Cranston have said that fundamentally being a liberal means believing in liberty. Of course, there's a long American tradition that says to be a liberal is to be wary of big government or be for limited government. I don't think either of those is actually all that attractive. The way I define it in the book is that liberalism is a modernist doctrine. It emerged in the early Enlightenment. It had antecedents in things like Stoicism and Christianity, but distinctly liberals are committed to two, maybe three principles, right? The first is all liberals are committed to this idea of the moral equality of all human beings, right? Now, moral equality does not necessarily mean that liberals support even the political equality of all human beings. More conservative liberals certainly didn't. And it definitely doesn't mean that all liberals support the economic equality of all human beings, although liberal socialists go a very long way towards that, right? But moral equality just basically means this idea that your life is as important as mine. My life is as important as the guy next door. And it's as important that your life goes well as that my life goes well, that the guy next door's life goes well. You get the idea, right? The second principle that liberals are committed to is this principle of individual liberty or personal liberty, right? The idea that I should be left largely free, to use the Rawlsian terms, to pursue my own vision of the good life, whatever it happens to be, constrained by certain kinds of reasonable limitations, which you already talked a little bit about with regard to the harm principle, right? That means, if I want to be a very religious person, I should be at for liberty to do that without interfering with other people. If I want to go and have sex with every consenting adult that will possibly have me while drinking myself silly, I should be allowed to do that, right? As long as I pay my taxes and obey the law beyond this. So liberalism tries to make space for personal liberty in this regard. And then the third principle I point out that some liberals, indeed, I would argue many liberals hold to, is this idea of fraternity or solidarity, particularly in the French revolutionary tradition. And what this just means is that liberals are committed to the idea that at a collective level, the people, quote unquote, should be self-governing, right? Which means they should participate in certain kinds of ways in politics to ensure that their rights or their interests are respected by the powers that be, or sometimes even in maximalist cases, there's this idea that the people should be authors of the laws that govern them. Think about somebody like Immanuel Kant and many in the Kantian tradition. And this principle is a little bit more of a kind of outlier amongst liberals, because there are some very right-wing liberals who are far less fond of it, right? Since they're wary that of an excess of citizen participation in politics, because I think that might be a danger to things like economic liberty, for example. But these are the three principles that I say kind of form the family core of all the different versions of liberalism that appear. Although, of course, all liberals understand how to instantiate those principles in very different kinds of ways.
No, but at the core of the differences lie in how we look at individualism, right? And you express the different kinds of individualism. So, where a person like me, I am a hardcore individualist, where I just don't understand policy making, keeping groups in mind, while I understand the importance of groups the more I mature now.
Mm-hmm.
For example, one of the biggest reasons I support reservations in India, literal quotas for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes in India, is because of the historical reality of Hindu society. At the same time, I oppose reservations which are allowed by all political parties in India, by the way, including the BJP. The BJP supports it as much as anyone else does, which is for the other backward classes, which is the OBC reservation, which happened in the 80s, which is post under a prime minister called VP Singh. Mm-hmm. Now, if the logic for reservations given in India was that there was historical oppression of the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, the other backward classes were equally party to it, as far as I'm concerned. So we cannot create an Olympics. And now the reservation boogie has opened so much that in certain states of India, it is in Tamil Nadu, it is 69%. And it is not for the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. It is for the OBCs, because the dominant political outfits of those states are the OBC political outfits, and we have actually opened the Pandora's box there. But where would a person like me fall? What kind of an individualist I am? Because I partially support reservations, don't go the whole hog. And then the Modi government now has added even more reservations, which is for the economically backward classes and some other general category classes, to the basis of economic backwardness. So where does this end? So what is happening to individualism as a concept then?
Yeah, very good. So all liberals are individualists in a certain respect, right? But there's a big difference in terms of the flavors of individualism that they support. And there are so many of them that we could be here all day talking about them. I'll just single out the two that are probably the most important for my book, right? So one of the things that I point out following the great Canadian political philosopher C.B. Macpherson is that classical liberals have typically been committed to what he calls possessive individualism, which is a very peculiar but quite powerful kind of individualism. What possessive individualists hold is that the individual essentially owns themselves and to a certain extent owns the product of their labor. And on top of that, there's this view that fundamentally we are driven by self-interest first and foremost, right? So I'm, for the most part, in it for me. You're, for the most part, in it for you. And we're both going to try to acquire as many of the good things in the world as possible to gratify our different desires, right? Nicer houses, nicer cars, big pool. I'd really like a boat. You get the idea, right? And this form of possessive individualism is, on the one hand, both a kind of anthropological view of human beings as fundamentally individualistic, self-interested, and separate from one another. And it also has normative implications, right? Since the idea is that in order to improve ourselves, we should labor, work hard, and through our own efforts kind of rise or fall in the world. Now, all possessive individualists recognize that it's not always going to be the case that whatever I invest my labor in, I'm actually going to get to keep, because the capitalist system very much depends upon my selling my labor to someone else in return for a wage. And they all have different kinds of justifications for that. But this idea is still fundamental that the world will be the oyster of those who are the rational and industrious, as Locke would put it, right? And this form of individualism has a kind of emancipatory quality from it. Even people like Karl Marx pointed out that it's a big advance on older feudal kinds of ways of looking at things. But it's very problematic in a lot of different ways, right? And what I argue is that liberal socialists are different from possessive individualists or classical liberals. And this starts with Mary Wollstonecraft and Thomas Paine, and definitely matures in Mill, and certainly people like Rawls, who I really admire, because they are what I call methodological collectivists and normative individualists. Now, those are big words, but I think that when I explain them, they'll hopefully make a bit of sense, right? So methodological collectivism just means that the kind of anthropological vision of human beings liberal socialists put forward is quite different, right? Liberal socialists follow people like, say, Aristotle, and acknowledging that human beings are not, in fact, kind of little atoms in the universe, each pursuing their own self-interest for the most part. All liberals are all people are kind of embedded in family structures, cultural structures, social structures, and all of this is extremely important when trying to figure out what's going to help people flourish. If you want to summarize it, the idea of methodological collectivism very simply, when Aristotle says man is by nature a social animal, or when some people say no man is an island, they're kind of capturing this aspect of it, right? And when I say that they are normative individualists, what I mean is that liberal socialists are still individualists in the sense that they think it is important for actual concrete biological individuals to flourish. And the way that they can flourish is ensuring that the society around them is organized so that the individual can flourish, right? What I mean by this, excuse me, is that liberal socialists are critical of the idea that we should focus on things like the nation's flourishing, or our civilization's flourishing, or obedience to God, right? Because they view all these things as abstractions that can be very easily reified or given undue importance over and above the actual needs of the concrete individuals that make up society.
So in a very weird way, in the modern day political parlance, only libertarians are in the atomistic sense, right? Everybody else is what you would call a methodological collectivist, right? Albeit of different shades, including me.
Yeah, in some ways, absolutely, right? I mean, look, it's by no means the case that liberal socialists are the only ones who have been critical of possessive individualism or atomistic individualism, right? Many conservatives have been extremely critical of atomistic individualism, going all the way back to people like Edmund Burke, right? Through people like Patrick Deneen, Yoram Hazony, many different people on the right who will always stress, people are born into families, religious groups, they have traditions associated with them, and it is necessary for people to respect these groups if they're going to lead a good life. And of course, almost anyone on the left would be very critical of possessive individualism, including liberal socialists, right? But let's just use Marx as an example, right? Marx would famously point out, men make their own history, but they do not do so under context of their own choosing, because there's a kind of material reality that we are thrown into that we all have to take into account when asking what kind of lives we're going to lead. So there are some libertarians today who remain committed to this kind of atomistic possessive ideal. But as you point out, it's a pretty unusual thing when you look across the political spectrum, even if once upon a time it was much more popular than I'd say it is right now.
Yeah, I mean, in my own case, I look at my life. I have changed so much from my 20s to my 30s, now
Yeah.
in my 40s, where if I take my political compass test now, I come very much in the center, leaning libertarian. Like if this is the quadrant and this is the center point, I would be somewhere here in the center, like just below. I'm very centrist in a lot of my views. I would actually want government intervention in many cases. I would like my core instinct is still very libertarian, as in I always have a suspicion of the state. That I still think that's when the libertarian in me comes out. But when I was reading your book, that was the one thing, like I did not know the word for it, methodological collectivism. That is the, now I have the word. Like and I think fierce individualists are also, in today's political sense, I think most people on the right of center are actually collectivists in some issues, like
Oh, yeah.
on national security. I think they're collectivists, right? Because the moment, if you believe in the sovereignty of the state is a collective. It's not an atomistic individual experience. What is the state? It's a group of individuals. What is a state otherwise?
Yeah, absolutely. And McPherson actually made this critique of possessive individualism in his book, The Political Theory of Possessive Individualism. And many others have made that about libertarianism and classical liberalism and neoliberalism since, right? McPherson pointed out that it's not the case that the more thoroughgoing the kind of possessive individualism, the smaller the collectivism. Actually, the more thoroughgoing the possessive individualism, the more collectivism you will require. And the reason, what he would pointed out is that, look, even something like private property, which many libertarians and many classical liberals claim to cherish, is very much a social institution, right? You might have possession in nature, but property as a kind of legal entitlement to exclude others from the use of a particular object and to reserve that use for yourself or whoever you choose, that very much needs to be instantiated by the state and by law, and requires an awful lot of coercion in order to enact your given scheme of property entitlements. Everyone deep down, I think, acknowledges that this atomistic vision either doesn't work, or if it does work, ironically, it's going to require an awful lot of collectivism in order to make it function, right?
Yeah. Even the anarchist dream of going back to this literal state of anarchy.
Yeah.
I mean, I find it very interesting when Michael Malice oftentimes talks about how the police is evil. The idea of a police is evil. There should be no police force, and many other things. Like, he's an anarchist.
Oh, yeah.
And I don't know if he's a serious anarchist or he's a Twitter anarchist or he's like, I don't know what he means. And this is not a diss on him before somebody misunderstands me. Like, I don't know where he comes from, but I find it very interesting. Now I want to focus on the socialisms. Like, what are the different kinds of socialisms then?
Sure. Well, as I point out in the book, the sad reality is that certainly in the Anglosphere, it's actually a little better, I'd say, in India and China than it is over here. Socialism is almost invariably associated with the Soviet Union, so kind of political authoritarianism with a command economy. And I want to be very clear, that is a form of socialism, certainly one that I think had enormous, really bad consequences for the world, and everyone should reject it, right? And leftists need to take very seriously this extreme blemish on our record if we're going to kind of move forward in pitching new forms of socialism. But what I point out is that it's not the case that socialism can ever be just associated with that, because historically there were a lot of different kinds of socialism out there, many of which were much more democratic and even hyper-democratic, and of course, given the title of my book, very liberal, right? So I argue that all the different families of socialism are committed to this idea of social ownership of the means of production, or as it's sometimes now called, the commanding heights of the economy, right? But what they understand social ownership to be is very, very different depending on who you talk to, right? Market socialists, for example, believe in market society. They think that social ownership means that workers manage the firms that they work at, or at least have a very big say in them. And then those firms will compete with one another in the market, and this will incentivize efficiency and incentivize innovation. And that's really what socialism amounts to. Others argue that social ownership of the means of production means something like what John Maynard Keynes, argued for. And I point out in the book that Keynes himself identified as a liberal socialist. So Keynes said, we can allow private ownership of property, we can allow market society to continue, but a lot of the profits produced by the economy should be expropriated by the state and then reinvested strategically to try to ensure economic efficiency and also provide full employment and other kinds of resources for the general population. And then you have socialists in the social democratic tradition, like Edward Bernstein, who said, really the best thing to do is to try to accomplish a blend of different things together and figure out what works. And of course, this is going to have an important influence on things like the Nordic model of social democracy, right? So take Sweden, for example. Olof Palme, the prime minister of Sweden, once prided himself on going, and I quote, further on the road to socialism than most states that have called themselves socialist. And the way that Sweden did this was by essentially setting up insurance schemes that everyone had to buy into. It's more complicated than this, but I'll just give you the gist of it, to make sure that everybody would be protected against things like old age, health insecurity, home insecurity, unemployment, et cetera, et cetera. And so what was established was effectively a kind of security state where people were insulated against all the different to's and fro's of life. So socialism is a very diverse family of different schools of thought. I want nothing to do with the command authoritarian versions of it. But just like there are very bad versions of liberalism, think about the kind of Pinochet-style authoritarianism that people like Hayek endorse, and they're bad forms of socialism, and they're good forms of socialism. And I think that a more liberal version of socialism isn't just a good form, but one that we should really invest our loyalties into.
Now, here's my problem with this argument, and this is something that I wanted to discuss with you. The moment you have a system where the interference of the state is required beyond a certain limit, you will have a tendency to allow for authoritarianism. And don't you think the biggest danger with socialism is its requirement of the state apparatus? And the state by nature in many ways is authoritarian. How do you deal with that fundamental dichotomy, which it's in the nature of the socialist idea?
Well, I would argue that many socialists have been deeply concerned with this problem, including many liberal socialists like John Rawls, for example. Right?
Yeah.
Now, there are too many answers to kind of exhaustively discuss that here, but I would say again that this is a kind of experimentalist attitude that you find in people like Palm really demonstrates that you can go really quite far in socializing the economy. Actually very far from kind of bringing about authoritarianism. It can actually be conducive to the extension of things like democracy, right? So in my vision of an ideal liberal socialism, what you would have was very robust redistributive mechanisms that would offer people things like universal healthcare, universal education, access to things like daycare, job security, retraining programs, et cetera, et cetera. Many of the things that you would see in robust social democratic states and robust democratic socialist states like the Nordic countries. And this would be accompanied with by a transition to a form of market socialism where workers would, for the most part, own the firms that they work at. They would compete with one another in the open marketplace, again, hopefully incentivizing efficiency and innovation. And the workers would redistribute the profits that were made by the firm both to themselves and, of course, to the firms. And this idea isn't all that unusual, actually, right? Just to give two examples, in Germany, co-determination models of firm management have been present for a very, very long time. And what happens in co-determination is effectively workers are given seats on the boards of major firms, and the firms can't actually make decisions without consulting the representatives of the workers. And as you know, German industry is some of the most competitive in the world. And then, ironically enough, the firms that are the most oriented by co-determination, like the auto industry, are amongst the most efficient in the world. And some research has suggested that's in part because workers who feel that they are part of the company rather than just working for the company really feel like they want to work hard, right? Because they're working for themselves rather than just for the boss. And the other example of this, of course, the unionization, right? So as we know, unionization rates have declined precipitously in many countries since the Reagan years. And we've seen the consequence of that since then. Even centrist commentators now have pointed out how real wages for the working classes and the middle classes have stagnated, how jobs are a lot harder to come by. And when you do get a job, it's usually likely to be a much more transient kind of thing. And a lot of that can be chalked up to the declining rates of unionization, both in the United States and other countries. So I'd really like to see a kind of reinvigoration of the labor movement in many of these countries. And I will say that there are some promising signs that suggest that that might be happening, right? One of the interesting transitions that's occurred in the United States, at least recently, is not only have you seen the president walk on a picket line for the first time ever, even his opponent, Donald Trump and J.D. Vance, are at least making gestures to the importance of unions and the labor movement because there's a kind of surge in popularity for those institutions right now. So I'm a bit more optimistic about the future of unions and the labor movement right now than I have been in quite some time. And I think that'd be another example of the kind of democratization of the economy that I'm talking about.
Yeah, my only problem is my fear remains constant, because I think anytime you give the state the levers to pull these things off, and I come from the Indian experiment,
Of course.
where most people don't know these things, that people often think that the Indian state, to use it in the modern pejorative right-wing terminology, is woke. The Indian state is not woke. The Indian state is Rawlsian. And there are court judgments after court judgments. If somebody bothered to actually read Indian judges, and how post the 1970s, 80s especially, a lot of court judgments on welfareism actually use the theory of John Rawls to justify all these things. All governments, including the current BJP government, by the way, is very Rawlsian in its approach to social justice. And they completely believe in the idea of what John Rawls would call positive discrimination. But the constant worry for me, and this comes again from the Indian experience, although I think over the years we've plugged in, I think the current government's biggest achievement in that sense has been the digitization, which has led to the plugging in of a lot of corruption in the welfare schemes, which has improved the efficiency of the state. But still, I still feel the state is very authoritarian, and that worries me. But one last question before we go, because I am conscious of the time. How does a right of center person fit into all of this in your political worldview?
Well, I think that there are two ways in which they fit into this, right? One is theoretically, and one is practically and politically, right? Theoretically, right, it's important for liberal socialists, and for that matter, all leftists, to recognize that classical liberalism was a progressive force when it came into the world. It remains an important strand of thought that continues to innovate to this day, right? And you pointed out how libertarians are committed to this kind of atomistic individualism still. There's a very rich new kind of libertarianism called bleeding heart libertarianism or left libertarianism that's emerged in the United States that takes a lot of these kinds of individualistic notions quite seriously, but moves them in somewhat more progressive directions. So the story isn't over for that strand of thought, and who knows, they might be able to come up with some interesting ideas heretofore. So I think that, once we acknowledge that, we can kind of have a respectable dialogue between those who are aligned with classical liberal libertarianism, etc., that try to sort out what the best approach for the future is going to be. And the second thing, of course, is politically, right? Any liberal socialist needs to be committed to the idea of fundamental human rights. That means, of course, commitment to freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of the press, etc., and of course, people's democratic right to agitate for their interest in their own political ideologies. And that means that we have to respect that classical liberals are going to be around for a very long time. They should be as entitled to share their opinions as anyone else, and to form political parties to try to advance their agenda as anyone else. And I, of course, will try to oppose them democratically, but I will respectfully oppose them. And I think that approaching one's opposition with this kind of respectful attitude is something that has been lost recently, but it's so essential to the well-functioning of a democracy that we really need to recover it.
I wait for the day to happen myself. Well, Matt, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. I really enjoyed reading this book, and these are the kinds of things that, if you are formulating ideas, that one should read, and it's good. So what's next? Have you thought of the next book?
Yeah, actually, there are two things that I'm working on right now. One is I'm editing a collection of essays with my good friend Ben Burgess from Give Them an Argument. People should give him a follow if they get a chance. It's on G.A. Cohen. G.A. Cohen was a great Canadian socialist thinker, taught at Oxford University, author of books like Karl Marx's Theory of History, or excuse me, more recently, If You're an Egalitarian, Why Is It You're So Rich? And that should be a lot of fun. I also have another project on the political right that should be coming up that I'm hoping to announce soon with my co-author, Jason Hanan. But it's not in ink yet, so I'll hold off on expressly saying what that's going to be. But it should be a big project, so excited about that.
Well, I wish you all the best, brother. I wish you all the best.
Thanks, Kushal. Great to see you again.
Yeah. All right, guys, we'll wrap it up. So in the description of the podcast, I will attach the link to Matt's book and his X handle. Go follow him on X. He's a prolific writer, a prolific author. If you are interested in understanding socialism and actually you want to challenge your priors, let's say you are someone who thinks capitalism is the solution for every problem, I think you should be in a position to understand what socialism is. Then you should go and read Matt and his work. And I do it all the time, and that's why I always make it a point. I have Matt has an open invitation on this podcast all the time. Whenever a new book comes, I tell him, just send me a copy and I will read it and I'll put it on, because it's very important to engage with views like this. So please go buy his book. And if you want to support me, well, you know the drill. Become a member or buy my book, or you can send your donations to UPI or Interact if you're in Canada. I'll see you guys next time. Until then, namaste. Take care. See you next time. Bye.